My name is Assal Rad, and I am a historian of the modern Middle East. And since the beginning of this war, and actually before this war, I have been correcting headlines. As a historian, I know how important narrative and storytelling is. And the way that this story is being told, in the Western media especially, is not right, and it's not accurate. So I tend to focus on headlines because the reality is most people don't read beyond them. Often news content is paywalled, or people just don't have that much time within their day to dedicate to every topic. Headlines do catch the eye though, and they shape the way that people think about these issues. The framing of stories on Palestine and Israel in the Western world, and particularly the US, has always been very one-sided. These headlines and stories, the way they're written, the use of language, it's all deliberate and all intentional. And I wanted people to see how a simple change of words could improve the way these stories are framed and the journalism behind it. One pattern I see so often is headlines that whitewash Israel's culpability in war crimes by not even mentioning the word Israel. An original headline from the New York Times reads, "Strikes pound Rafah, flatten large mosque." And this is an older headline. This is before the recent attacks we're seeing in Rafah now. There's so many issues with this one. But let's start with the most glaring. Which force is behind the strikes? It's Israel, right? So why is that not mentioned? It's an omission, and that omission is not accidental because you see a pattern of it happening. Then strikes. You could have added 3 letters and made it very clear that they were in fact airstrikes. There's a mention of Rafah, but no reference to the fact that it's in Gaza, that Gaza is a part of the Palestinian territories, and this might confuse people who aren't knowledgeable about the entirety of the geography. But also the fact that Rafah is the last refuge for Palestinians in the Strip is so important. I mean, that's the reason why Rafah is in the news and in the headline in the first place. You know, there might be a counter-argument that says, well, all of those details are what the entire article is for. The headline doesn't have to give all of that away. But you see that the addition of just a few words makes it very easy to bring the context into the headline. And then you can explain the details in the body of the piece. But this headline in its original form is so problematic because it attributes basically nothing to no one. You're not clear where this is taking place, you don't know what exactly happened, and you have no clue who did it.
Thursday's attack has been described as a massacre of civilians. Hundreds of starving Palestinians had gathered to collect food aid when they were attacked.
So this headline was published after the Flower Massacre, which happened in February of this year, where we saw really horrifying footage of Palestinians killed while trying to get food. The headline reads, "In chaotic scene, many are killed and wounded as Israelis open fire," which is just an absurd way of phrasing what happened. So one of the first problems with this phrasing is it makes it seem like chaos is inherent to the situation because it's Gaza, not because of the external forces, specifically the Israeli forces, that are causing the situation. Also, it wasn't a chaotic scene, it was a massacre. And to call it a chaotic scene is just an obscene way of talking about it. The headline also says, "Many are killed and wounded." They've used passive voice to describe a situation in which more than 100 starving people who are being deliberately starved, were killed. Israeli forces opened fire on them as they were trying to get food from the aid convoys. That's what happened. When you look at reporting from other conflicts, like Russia's war against Ukraine, you see the difference in language used very quickly. In this headline, how Russia is using Ukrainians' hunger as a weapon of war. You can see very clearly there's no passive voice. Russia is named as the responsible party, and the crime that is being committed by Russia is stated clearly in plain English. Also, Ukrainians are named as the victims. If you notice, I underlined that line, residents of Mariupol, Ukraine, because that's not how Palestinians in Gaza are talked about. Writers use Gazans rather than Palestinians. So Ukrainians in a specific location in Ukraine are still called Ukrainians, but in the case of Gaza, Too often, there are no references to Palestinians. And this goes back to the idea of how, not just in the media, but also in our political discourse, Palestine is fragmented. People might not understand that Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, they're all part of a Palestinian state. They're all Palestinian territories. And if you single out Gazans without explaining that they're Palestinians, you're essentially separating Gaza from the larger issue of Palestinian statehood and liberation. And this falls into an Israeli pattern of erasing Palestinian identity and Palestinian statehood by treating each of these illegally occupied territories and their people as separate entities. People in Gaza are Palestinians, and journalists should call them that. I share a lot of headlines from The Onion. It's a satirical news site in the US, and their headlines are supposed to be a joke. They're supposed to be humorous exaggerations that sort of put a mirror up to society and politics, and especially the way that our own media covers events. But some of The Onion's older posts on this particular issue, on Israel-Palestine, and the US's role in it, they almost read like predictions. We've come to the point where the situation with Gaza has become so atrocious that The Onion's headlines have become pretty spot on. This headline reads, "Netanyahu assures critics he still has the utmost respect for US money." And the context in which I shared it was that Netanyahu had canceled a visit by an Israeli delegation to Washington, D.C. because the US finally didn't veto a ceasefire resolution at the United Nations. They did everything, and this was back in March of this year. They did everything to undermine the resolution still by calling it non-binding, but they didn't actually veto it. But Netanyahu wasn't so upset that he turned down the $3.3 billion in taxpayer dollars that the US is giving Israel to fund its wars. He was very quick, in fact, to thank America for that money. Mind you, this Onion headline is from originally 2015, when the Obama administration was at odds with the Netanyahu government. But despite those very clear disagreements, Obama still handed Israel a $38 billion package of military aid over 10 years that was the largest of its kind. Years later, the Onion's headline is still applicable because Netanyahu is still in power, he's still snubbing the US and undermining US policy and international law, and he's still getting billions of dollars, which he's happy to get. When you talk about a mask-off moment, Gaza has really shredded anything that resembles the sort of world order that we had become accustomed to hearing Western powers, especially the United States and mainstream media in the US, champion for such a long time. And they're still using that language, but with such an egregious level of hypocrisy that everyone can see it now. And I think that's the part that's resonating with so many people with these headline corrections. The state of Israel seems to be able to get away with anything, and not be held accountable. And the fact that the media is so complicit in this process, that it continues to whitewash Israel's crimes and parrot basically whatever the US's official line is, it's a real abdication of its role. And these incomplete, inaccurate headlines are shaping how people think, and that's why I think it's so important to point it out.
Thanks for watching. Now hit that like button and leave us a comment to let us know what you think about anything that we covered this week. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Does anyone really call it X? Facebook and Instagram for updates from the show. Links are in the description.